Euthyphro from the last days of Socrates. The only reason I'm really streaming myself doing this is because it gives me encouragement to actually read it out loud and sort of digest what's being read here. I think otherwise there's no one else to really hold me accountable for being able to read the book. Isn't that an interesting thought? Well, anyway, Euthyphro. In 399 BC, a meeting takes place before the court of the king of Akron. Let me repeat that, because I already screwed up. In 399 BC, a meeting takes place before the court of the king Akron. Two litigants discuss their respective cases. Euthyphro. What's come over you, Socrates, that you've deserted your usual pastimes in the Lyceum, and are now lurking here by the king's porch? It surely can't be that you, too, have a suit before the king's eye? Socrates. No, indeed. The Athenians don't call it suit, Euthyphro, but prosecution. Euthyphro says, What? Somebody's prosecuting you. I gather. I'll hardly accuse you of prosecuting somebody else. Socrates. No, indeed. Euthyphro. Somebody's doing it to you? Socrates says, Quite. Euthyphro asks, Who is he? Socrates says, I don't even know the man at all well myself, Euthyphro. He's obviously some young unknown, but they call him Miletus, I believe. He's from the deme of Pythus. And you might recall a Miletus from Pythus, with straight hair and not much of a beard, but a rather hooked nose. Euthyphro. I can't recall him, Socrates. Well, what's the prosecution he's brought against you? Socrates. What is it? No trivial one, in my view. To have discovered as a young man a matter of such magnitude is no mean thing. For he knows, as he claims, how the young men are being corrupted, and who it is that's corrupting them. The chances are that he's a clever sort of fellow, who has noticed how, in my ignorance, I'm corrupting his contemporaries. And goes to the city as if to his mother to tell on me. He seems to be the only one in politics to approach the subject correctly, because it's quite right to make young men and their future excellence your first concern. Just as a good farmer is likely to concern himself first with the young plants, and only then with the others, and so Miletus too, perhaps, is first weeding out people like me who corrupt the young shoots of youth, as he puts it, and then he'll evidently move on to looking after older persons and be responsible for countless great benefits to the city. The logical outcome for one who has made so promising a start. Euthyphro. I should like to think so, Socrates, but I'm very fearful of the opposite outcome. In my views, he is beginning by striking at the very heart of the city and trying to harm you. So tell me, what is it he says you are doing to corrupt the youth? Socrates. Heavens! Strange things, my man. If we take him literally at least, he claims I'm a manufacturer of gods. And he says this is why he's prosecuted me. That I create new gods and don't recognize the old ones. Euthyphro. I see, Socrates. It's because you claim that the divine sign keeps visiting you. He's launched this prosecution on the grounds that you improvise on the subject of the gods. And so he's off to the law courts to present you in a bad light, knowing that such things are easily misrepresented before the great public. They ridicule me too, whenever I say something in the assembly about matters divine and predict the future for them, saying that I'm crazy, yet in all my predictions I've spoken the truth. They just have a grudge against all of us who are inclined that way. One shouldn't be bothered about them. Just meet them head on. And Socrates says, You may be right, Euthyphro, that it's no matter to be ridiculed, you see. I don't think the Athenians are particularly concerned if they believe somebody to be clever, as long as he's not inclined to teach these skills of his. But if they think anybody makes others as well, just as clever, they get angry with him, perhaps because of grudge, as you say, perhaps for some other reason. Euthyphro says, I've no appetite for testing how they feel about me in this matter. And Socrates says, perhaps it's because you appear to make yourself scarce. They refuse to teach your skills. But I fear that I, because of my generosity, appear to them to communicate whatever I've got indiscriminately to anybody, not just without a fee. For I'd even be glad to tip anybody willing to listen to me. So, as I said just now, if they were just going to ridicule me, as you say they do, it would be pleasant enough to pass the time in court jesting and laughing. Whereas now, if they are going to take things seriously, where it will all end is clear to no one but you soothsayers. And Euthyphro says, "Oh well, perhaps it won't be such an ordeal, Socrates, and you'll contest your suit according to plan, as I think I'll contest mine." Socrates, "And what is your suit then, Euthyphro? Are you prosecuting or defending?" Euthyphro, "Prosecuting." Socrates says, "Whom?" Euthyphro, "Once again, it's somebody I'm supposed to be crazy to be prosecuting." Socrates, "What? Are you after a wild goose in flight?" Euthyphro, "He's very far from flying. In fact, he's really quite elderly." Socrates says, "Who is this person?" Euthyphro responds, "My father." Socrates, "Your own father, Euthyphro?" Euthyphro, "Exactly." Socrates, "What's the charge? What's the suit for?" Euthyphro, "For homicide, Socrates." Socrates, "Heavens above! It's certainly beyond the masses to know the right course, Euthyphro. I mean, I really don't think it's an action to be taken by the man in the street, but only by somebody already far advanced along the path of wisdom." Euthyphro, "Far advanced for sure, Socrates." Socrates, "Then is the man who died at the hands of your father one of your household? I suppose it's obvious. You wouldn't have prosecuted him merely for the sake of an outsider, not for murder." And Euthyphro responds, "It's laughable, Socrates, that you think it makes some difference whether the dead man was an outsider or a relative, and not realize that it's this alone which one must watch, whether or not the killer killed with justification. If so, let him be. Otherwise, proceed against him, even if the killer shares your hearth and table. Your pollution is as great as his if you live with such a person in the knowledge of what he has done and fail to purge both yourself and him by taking legal proceedings against him. As a matter of fact, the deceased was a hired hand of mine, and when we were farming on Naxos, he was laboring there for us. Well, he got drunk, became angry with one of our servants, and slit his throat. So my father bound him hand and foot, threw him into a ditch, and sent a fellow here to find out from the interpreter what he should do. But in the meantime he took no interest in the prisoner, and neglected him in the belief that he was a murderer, and there was no concern of his if he died, which is exactly what happened. What with starvation, exposure, and confinement, he died before the messenger got back from the interpreter. So both my father and my other relatives are all the more annoyed at this, because I am prosecuting my father for homicide on a murderer's behalf. They claim that he didn't kill him, or even if he'd killed him outright, I still shouldn't be concerned about that type of person, because they'd think it's unholy for a son to prosecute his father for homicide, badly mistaking the position of divine law on what's holy and what's unholy. So there's a little sidebar here, I'll read it. So Euthyphro is induced by ironic flattery to reveal to Socrates what he believes holiness really is. He offers his own, and in parentheses it says, and similar, in parentheses, conduct as an example of holiness, supporting his statement with references to popular myths. And Socrates expresses bewilderment at this kind of religious story, and repeats that he requires a general standard against which he may assess the holiness or otherwise any given action, right? So, I'll continue. So, Socrates says, "My word, Euthyphro, does that not mean that you think you understand religion so exactly, matters holy and unholy, that is, that you have no misgivings about the circumstances you describe? Aren't you afraid, in taking your father to court, that you too might turn out to be doing an unholy deed?" And Euthyphro responds, "No, I would be of no use, Socrates, nor would Euthyphro differ at all from the common herd of men, if I didn't understand the details of all things of this sort." Socrates says, "Remarkable, Euthyphro. In that case, it would be best for me to become your pupil, Before I defend this prosecution against Meletus, I could challenge him on this very point. I'd say that for my part, I'd always, even in my past, considered it of great importance to know about religious matters, and that now, since he claims that I'm at fault in improvising and innovating on questions of religion, I have naturally become a pupil of yours. And presuming Meletus, I could say that you admit that Euthyphro is an authority in such matters. You must accept that my beliefs are true too, and not bring me to court. If you don't admit it, then bring a suit against that teacher of mine before you tackle me, for being the ruin of his elders, me, by what he teaches me, and his own father by the criticism and punishment that he metes out to him. And if he doesn't do as I say, and either drop the suit or indict you instead of me, I'd better deliver the same challenge to him in the law court. And Euthyphro says, Goodness, yes, Socrates. If he should try a prosecution on me, I discover where his weak spot is, and he'd be on the defensive in court long before I was. Socrates says, I realize that as well as you do, dear friends, that's why I'm anxious to become a pupil of yours. I know that Meletus here, among others, does not seem to notice you, whereas he observes me with such ease and such acuity that he's indicted me for impiety. So, for heaven's sake, tell me now what you were just then affirming you knew. What do you say piety and impiety are? Be it in homicide or in other matters. Or isn't holiness the same in every sphere of activity? And unholiness, too, the opposite of everything holy, and the same as itself, so that everything to be called unholy has one standard, which determines its unholiness? Euthyphro says, Completely so, Socrates. Socrates then says, Tell me then, what do you say holiness is, and what is unholiness? And Euthyphro responds, Well, I say that holiness is what I am doing now, prosecuting a criminal, either for murder, or for sacrilegious theft, or for some other such thing, regardless of whether that person happens to be of one's father, or one's mother, or anyone else at all, whereas not to prosecute is unholy. Take a look, Socrates, and I'll show you clear evidence of divine law. The law that one must not let off the perpetrator of impiety, whoever he should happen to be. I've already used it to show others that this would be the right way to proceed. You see, people themselves do in fact acknowledge that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods. And they admit that he imprisoned his own father because he had unjustly swallowed his sons, and the latter too had castrated his father for similar reasons. But in my case, they are annoyed with me for prosecuting my father for his crime, and so they make contradictory assertions about the gods' conduct and about mine. Socrates says, Could this be why I'm defending a prosecution, Euthyphro? That whenever somebody talks like this about the gods, I find it very difficult to accept? That would be a natural reason for somebody to claim I'm in error. So now, if their view is shared even by you who understand such things, then evidently the rest of us are going to have to agree. What more could we say when we admit for ourselves that we know nothing about them? But be a good fellow and tell me, do you really believe that these things happen like this? And Euthyphro says, These and still more wonderful things, Socrates, which ordinary people do not know. Socrates, then, do you think that there really is a civil war among the gods and fearful hostility and battles and so on, the kind of thing described by the poets, depicted by fine artists upon such sacred artifacts, not least upon the robe at the great Panathenaion, which is brought up to the Acropolis, covered in decorations of that kind? Are we to say that it's all true, Euthyphro? Euthyphro says, Not merely that, Socrates, but, in parentheses, as I said just now, in parentheses, I'll tell you much more about divine beings, if you like. I know you'll be stunned by it. And Socrates says, I shouldn't be surprised, but you shall tell me that another time, when we have leisure. For the time being, try to answer more clearly what I asked you just now. You see, when I asked you before what holiness is, you didn't adequately explain it. But you said that what you are doing now, prosecuting your father for impiety, does happen to be holy. So Euthyphro says, yes, I was telling you the truth, Socrates. And Socrates says, possibly, but look, Euthyphro, you do say that there are many other things too, which are holy. And Euthyphro says, and so there are. He agrees, right? And Socrates says, do you remember then that this wasn't what I was asking you to give me? One or two examples from a multitude of holy things, right? I asked you for that special feature through which all holy things are holy. For you were in agreement, surely, that it was by virtue of a single standard that all unholy things are unholy, and all holy things holy. Or don't you remember? And Euthyphro says, I do. And Socrates, he says, so explain to me what this standard itself is, so that when I observe it and use it as a means of comparison, I may affirm that whatever actions are like it, yours or anybody else's, are holy, while those not of that kind are not. And Euthyphro says, well, if that's what you want, Socrates, then that's what I'll give. So, indeed, it is what I want, Socrates says. And so, your sidebar here. Euthyphro offers a universal definition of holiness, satisfying Socrates in form, but not in content, right? To define holiness in terms of what the gods regard with favor seems difficult for those who accept traditional tales of disputes among the gods, for the same action will please one god and annoy another, right? So Euthyphro retreats to position that the holy is that which all the gods approve of, only to be confronted with the problem that since, what is divinely approved, right, is determined by what the gods approve, well, what the gods approve is determined by what is holy, and what is divinely approved cannot be identical in meaning with what is holy. So here's an example here. So where A determines B and B determines C, but A is not necessarily equal to C. So this argument has been much analyzed and is a powerful weapon against those who believe morality can be explained purely in terms of God's will. So Euthyphro says, right then, what is agreeable to the gods is holy, and what is not agreeable is unholy. And Socrates says, simply splendid, Euthyphro. You've now answered in just the way I asked you to. Admittedly, I don't yet know whether you're correct or not, right? But obviously you'll go on to demonstrate the truth of what you say. And Euthyphro says, certainly. Socrates, come then, let's examine our thesis. For any action or person, if it is divinely approved, it is holy. And if it's divinely disapproved, it is unholy, right? So, and they're not the same, right? But exact opposites, the holy and the unholy. Is that it? Euthyphro says, that's quite right. And Socrates says, and does it seem well stated? And Euthyphro agrees. He says, I think so, Socrates. And Socrates says, haven't we also said that the gods have quarrels, Euthyphro, and disputes with one another, that there's enmity among them with one with another? And Euthyphro says, we have. And Socrates says, and what is the subject, please, of those disputes which cause enmity and anger? Let's look at this. Let's look at it like this. If you and I were in dispute about which of two numbers is greater, would our dispute about this turn us into enemies and make us angry with each other? Or should we quickly settle our differences by resorting to arithmetic, right? Euthyphro says, certainly we should. Socrates says, and surely, if we were in dispute about the relative size of two things, we could quickly bring an end to our dispute by resorting to measurement. Euthyphro says, yeah, that is so. And Socrates says, and weighing, I would imagine, it would be the way for us to get a case of relative weight decided. And Euthyphro says, of course. And Socrates says, then over what might we dispute and fail to find some solution? What could we become enemies over and get angry about? Perhaps you have no ready answer, but I'll make a suggestion. Consider whether it's over what's just and unjust, or fine and despicable, or good and bad. Aren't these the things over which we quarrel and can't come to an adequate means of resolution? Leading us at times to make enemies of each other, you, me, and everybody else? And Euthyphro says, yes. It's that sort of dispute, Socrates. Those are the issues. Socrates says, what of the gods, Euthyphro? If they disagree at all, wouldn't they disagree for just these reasons? Euthyphro says, inevitably. And Socrates says, then among the gods, too, my fine fellow, your account suggests that different parties think different things. Pardon me. I'll just repeat the whole thing. So Socrates says, then among the gods too, my fine fellow, your account suggests that different parties think different things, just, or fine, or despicable, or good, or bad, because they would not apparently be quarreling with one another unless they were in dispute about this, right? Euthyphro says that's correct. And Socrates, surely those things which each party regards as just and good it also approves of, and is approve of the opposite kind. Euthyphro agrees here. He says, quite. So Socrates, but then again, according to your claim, the same things are considered just by some and unjust by others. Those matters of dispute about which they quarrel and make war on one another. Is that right? Euthyphro, right? Socrates, then the same things, it's likely, are both disapproved of and approved of by the gods. The same things would be divinely approved of and divinely disapproved. And Euthyphro says, likely enough. Then Socrates says, then the same things would be both holy and unholy according to that account. And Euthyphro says, I suppose so. So Socrates, he's like, okay, then you've not answered my question, Euthyphro. I wasn't asking what turns out to be equally holy and unholy. Whatever is divinely approved is also divinely disapproved, apparently. Consequently, my dear Euthyphro, it'd be no surprise if, in trying to punish your father, as you do now, you did something approved by Zeus and offensive to Cronos and Uranus, or approved by Hephaestus and offensive to Hera, and so on for any one of the gods who disagrees with any other of the subjects. And Euthyphro says, well, it's my belief, Socrates, that not one of the gods disputes with another on this, that whoever kills someone unjustly should pay the penalty. And Socrates says, what about men? Have you ever yet heard any human disputing the claim that a person who killed unjustly or did anything else unjustly should pay the penalty? And Euthyphro says, there's no way they ever stop disputing these things, particularly in the courts. Though they've committed a host of crimes, there's nothing they won't do or say in their efforts to escape the penalty. And Socrates says, and do they also admit they've done wrong, Euthyphro, and in spite of their admission, still claim that they should not pay the penalty? And Euthyphro says, there's no way that they do that. Socrates says, then they don't do or say everything, for I don't think that they have the nerve to argue that they should not pay the penalty, even supposing they've done wrong. I think they deny they've done wrong. Is it so? Euthyphro, that's true. Socrates, so at least they're not disputing whether the wrongdoer must pay the penalty, but perhaps what they dispute is who the wrongdoer is, or what he did, or when. Euthyphro agrees, he says true. Socrates, then don't the gods go through the same experience? If they really do quarrel about what's just and unjust as you say, and some of them say others are in the wrong while those others deny it, but even so, my friend, surely no one, neither God nor man, has the nerve to say that the actual wrongdoer should not pay the penalty. Euthyphro, yes, what you're saying is true, Socrates, in principle at least. Socrates, but in each case, Euthyphro, I think the disputants, both men and gods, if gods really did dispute things, are disputing what has been done. They quarrel about some deed, and one party says it's been done justly, the other unjustly, right? Euthyphro, quite so. Socrates, come now, Euthyphro, my friend. Teach me to make me wiser. What proof have you got that all gods regard as unjust the death of that man who, as a hired hand, was responsible for somebody's death, was bound by the master of the man who was killed, and died from the conditions of his imprisonment before his imprisoner heard what he should do from the interpreter? What proof have you that it is the correct for a son to bring a prosecution on behalf of this kind of person and denounce his own father for homicide? Come, try and show me some clear proof that this action, beyond a doubt, is thought by all gods to be correct. And if you show me to my satisfaction, I shall never stop acclaiming your wisdom. So, of course, just a little sidebar here. Socrates has obviously challenged Euthyphro here, and let's see what Euthyphro has to say. So Euthyphro says, well, it's no small task, probably, Socrates, though I could show you perfectly clearly. Socrates says, I understand. You think I'm a slower learner than the jurymen, because you'll obviously give them a demonstration that it was unjust and that all gods disapprove of such things. With Euthyphro says, with absolute clarity, Socrates, as long as they listen to what I say. And Socrates says, oh, they'll listen, but as long as they think you're making sense. But here's a question, which I thought of while you were speaking. I asked myself, however well Euthyphro were to teach me that all the gods in unison think that such a killing is unjust, what more have I learnt from him about what the holy and the unholy are, right? Alright, so this action would apparently be divinely disapproved. But you see, it appeared just now that what was holy was not, were not distinguished in this way. For what was divinely disapproved also appeared to be divinely approved. So I'll let you off this, Euthyphro. If you like, let all the gods think it unjust, and let them all disapprove of it. But what about this correction that we are making to our account to the effect that what all the gods disapprove of is unholy? What all approve of is holy, what some approve of and others disapprove of is neither or both. Is this how you would like our definition to run concerning the holy and the unholy? Euthyphro says, what is there to prevent it, Socrates? Socrates says, nothing to prevent me, Euthyphro. But you look at your own position and ask yourself whether, on the basis of this assumption, you will most easily teach me what you promised. And Euthyphro says, well, I should certainly say that what's holy is whatever all the gods approve of, and that its opposite, what all the gods disapprove of, is unholy. Socrates says, as we to investigate further, Euthyphro, and see if it's well stated, or are we to let it be and to accept something from ourselves or from another, agreeing that it is so, if somebody merely states that this is the position, or should we examine what the speaker means? Euthyphro says, examine it. But I myself think that this has now been excellently stated. Socrates says, we'll soon be in a better position to judge, my good chap. Consider the following point. Is the holy approved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because it's approved? Euthyphro says, I don't know what you mean, Socrates, and to be quite frank, I don't know what he means either, but Socrates says, well, I'll try to put it more clearly. We speak of a thing being carried, or carrying, being led, or leading, being seen, or seeing. And you understand that all such pairs are different from each other, and how they're different. Euthyphro says, I certainly think I understand. And Socrates says, is there not also something which is approved, while that which is approving is different from it? Of course. Socrates says, then tell me, is what's being carried because it gets carried, or for some other reason? Euthyphro says, no, for this reason. And Socrates says, and what's being led is being led because it gets led, right? And what's being seen is being seen because it gets seen. So Euthyphro says, certainly. And Socrates says that it is not the case that because it's being seen, it gets seen, but the opposite. Because it gets seen, it's being seen. Nor that because of things being led, it gets led, but because it gets led, it's being led. And nor that because of things being carried, it gets carried, but because it gets carried, it's being carried. Isn't it obvious what I mean, Euthyphro? I mean that if something is coming to be so, or is being affected, then it's not the case that it gets to be so, or because it's coming to be so, but that it's coming to be so because it gets to be so. Nor that it gets affected because it's being affected, but it's being affected because it gets affected. Or don't you go along with this? To which Euthyphro says, I certainly do. Socrates says, then isn't being approved an example either of coming to be so or of being affected by something? Euthyphro says, certainly. And Socrates says, then this too is comparable with the previous cases. Something does not get approved because it's being approved by those who approve of it, but it's being approved because it gets approved. Euthyphro says, necessarily. So Socrates says, well then, what is it that we're saying about the holy Euthyphro? Surely that it gets approved by all the gods on your account. Euthyphro says, yes. And Socrates says, is that because it's holy or for some other reason? And Euthyphro says, no, that's the reason. And Socrates says that it gets approved because it's holy. It's not holy by reason of getting approved. Euthyphro says, presumably. And Socrates here says, whereas it's precisely because it gets approved that it is approved by the gods and divinely approved. Euthyphro says, of course. And Socrates says, then the divinely approved is not holy, Euthyphro, nor is the holy divinely approved, as you say, but it's different from this. And Euthyphro says, how so, Socrates? And Socrates says, because we've admitted that the holy gets approved for the reason that it's holy, but it's not because it gets approved that it's holy, right? Euthyphro says, yes. And Socrates says, but then again, the divinely approved, because it gets approved by the gods, is divinely approved by this very act of approval. It's not the case that it gets approved because it's divinely approved, right? And Euthyphro says, that is true. And Socrates says, but if the divinely approved and the holy were really the same thing, Euthyphro, my friend, then one, if the holy were getting approved because of its being holy, the divinely approved too would be getting approved because of its being divinely approved. Whereas two, if the divinely approved were divinely approved on account of its getting approved by the gods, then the holy would be holy too on account of its getting approved. But as things are, you can see that the two are oppositely placed, as being altogether different from each other. For the one is such as to get approved, because it gets approved, while the other gets approved precisely because it's such as to get approved. And perhaps Euthyphro, when asked what the holy is, you don't want to point out the essence for me, but to tell me of some attribute which attaches to it, saying that holiness has the attribute of being approved by all gods.